each emotion represents a need. And most of the time we will have multiple feelings at the same time because we have multiple needs at the same time. So part of problem solving is identifying all of your needs, aka all of your feelings, and coming up with solutions that take into account all of those needs. If you don't do that, then again, they don't go away. They will just affect you, but in a reactionary way.
Welcome to Work Unscripted. I'm your host, Marlo Lyons. I'm here to toss aside the corporate scripts for unfiltered truths. We are tackling real work challenges with no sugarcoating, providing you with the strategies to thrive and find fulfillment in your career. It's time to turn the page. It's time to be unscripted. Today, we're diving into a topic that nearly every high-achieving professional, especially women, struggle with, whether they admit it or not. That relentless inner voice, the one that nitpicks, overanalyzes, compares, catastrophizes, and tells you you're falling short even when you're knocking it out of the park. Yep, I'm talking about your inner critic, or as today's guest calls it, the inner bully. I'm joined by therapist and military veteran Elaine Belson, who has spent decades studying how emotional triggers, fear of rejection, and old coping patterns shape the way high-functioning women show up at work. We're talking about emotional intelligence, coping mechanisms, self-validation, imposter syndrome. All the things we feel, but rarely talk about openly. So if you've ever thought, why am I so hard on myself? Or how do I stop overthinking every little thing? This conversation is going to connect a lot of dots. Let's get unscripted. Elaine, so great to have you on the show.
Thank you for having me.
I'm so glad you're here, and I want to dive right in because I think there is so much to talk about psychology in the workplace. So let's start with something I know that I've struggled with off and on throughout my career, and I think most people struggle with, and it's that voice in my head. It's that mean girl critic, right?
Mm-hmm.
And It's not always very nice to me. So what does that inner critic sound like in high-functioning women, and why is it so brutal?
Right. Well, I call it the inner bully. And what I find is that almost everybody does 6 things, which we refer to as ruminating. They mind read, they anticipate other people's reactions, they compare themselves to others, they second guess themselves, they overanalyze, and they criticize themselves. And right, yeah, sound familiar.
Anybody high performing, right, will do that, more or less.
It's pretty pervasive. It's rare that I don't find that. And I think part of it is because we don't talk about mental health and people don't learn other ways of coping with their emotions. And it's also because we're human beings and human beings are complicated. Right? I always say you're more complicated than you give yourself credit for. So, it really starts with fear of rejection and failure, which I believe is innate. And what I also find is that most people experience feelings of inadequacy. That is, I'm not good enough, I'm undeserving, there's something inherently wrong with me. And I think it's unconscious, right? But I think it drives a lot of people's reactions and the way that they cope. So what happens is that if you are afraid of rejection and failure and you already feel inadequate, you are going to go out of your way to avoid rejection and failure. You're going to compensate. And so that's what happens is that people overcompensate. And that's where those 6 things come in.
Overcompensate. That's so interesting. And because I don't ever say to myself, like, I stink, I'm not good enough. So how does this show up that you're unknowingly kind of bullying yourself at work or at home?
Yeah, we call them automatic thoughts. They become so automatic that we don't even realize that we're doing them. But I have a list, and oftentimes when I'm working with women, I will present this list and ask them to go through it and circle the ones that they feel that resonate with them. And there's usually a lot on there, things like I must never put my needs ahead of anybody else. If someone criticizes me, I must have done something wrong. I must never make mistakes, et cetera, et cetera. So this inner dialogue that you play in your head. And again, it's a coping mechanism. I call it chocolate cake because if you think about if whenever you're upset, you might reach for chocolate cake, right? And so you have to think about these negative messages in the same way. They are something that we reach for in order to cope with fear of rejection and failure. So there's nothing wrong with fear of rejection and failure. It's just that there's another way to cope with it other than beating yourself up.
Do men have the same voice, or do I find that women have it more often than men, or just is it more prevalent in women?
I think it is more prevalent in women. There's another piece to this. So I think women are more relationship oriented. That's my experience. And I think that part of that is innate, and I think part of that is cultural. I mean, we have been in some ways over the years historically restricted into certain roles that are very relationship oriented, like nurse, secretary, teacher, mom, right? And so this all has to do with what we call sense of self, where you get your sense of self from. So when we're young, the role of a parent is to be what we call a mirroring object for their child. That is, how a child sees him or herself depends on how the parent reacts. So if little Susie comes running home and she says, "Mommy, I fell off my bike." And mom says, "Well, you should be more careful next time." Not earth-shatteringly inappropriate, but compare that to, "Well, that's okay. I know you're a great bike rider and you'll get back on and you'll do great." So you compare like the first one exponentially over a child's life and what kind of sense of self is that child going to get, right? And so they learn to use that inner critic as a way of avoiding, making mistakes, rejection, failure, etc. So what I teach people instead, let me just say this. So what happens is as you get older, you start using other people as mirrors. And I think that's where it kind of gets into where women may be more people pleasers than men are because we are so relationship oriented and we get a lot of our sense of self from how other people treat us, how other people react to us. And what I tell people is you should never use other people as mirrors for a sense of self. Because if you go to like carnivals, and they have those really warped mirrors, you have to think of people like carnival mirrors because it's very rare that people articulate their feelings. They speak in terms of feelings, and they often don't know how to manage their feelings. So you get a distorted reflection.
I'm sure there's a lot of women and men who just don't know how to manage their feelings. They were never taught how to manage their feelings. So the first thing is to note that most people haven't, right? How do you separate that voice, what that voice is telling us, or that mirror that we're all taking in, whether it's the performance review or the manager who gives us feedback, and we're thinking that that is who we are.
Right. So, anytime you catch yourself feeling anxious or bad about yourself, what you want to do is you want to start to learn to self-validate. So I teach people two techniques. I call one the be your own best friend, and the other one the opposite of the golden rule. So what I tell people is that rather than beating yourself up, right, as a way of avoiding rejection and failure, what you want to do is you want to learn to problem solve and to, first of all, identify your feelings. Where are they coming from? And what's in my control? And then you also want to learn how to self-validate. So be your own best friend is anytime you catch yourself being hard on yourself, you want to ask yourself, would I talk to somebody else I care about this way? And chances are the answer is going to be no. So then you ask yourself, well, how would I talk to somebody else? And normally what do? We say, it's okay. You're fine the way that you are, or, don't worry about what other people think. And so that is what we're trying to tap into, is that ability to self-validate that I believe everybody has, because they do it for other people all the time. And so, so it's number one, learning how to self-validate. And then number two, learning that the way to cope anytime you feel, anxious, fear of, perfection, fear of failure or rejection, that you want to problem solve. Ask yourself, what specifically am I afraid is going to happen? And where is it coming from? What's in my control?
So understand the feelings,
Right.
then problem solve. So it's like, how does this
Yes.
feel to you? And then figure out, like, what are my steps from this?
Right. Yeah. Anytime you find yourself beating yourself up, that's telling you there's probably an uncomfortable feeling there. And that's what you want to do. Our feelings are there to help us to make good decisions. And what you were saying earlier about how most people don't learn how to manage their emotions, because most people are not taught that we have feelings for the same reason we have pain and hunger. There's a survival mechanism. So if I touch a hot stove, right, I'm going to feel pain in my hand, because if I didn't, I would burn my hand. If I don't eat for days, I feel hungry, because if I didn't, I would starve myself to death. So we have emotions for the same reason, right? They are information of a need or a threat that we're overlooking. And so we have learned how to cope with our emotions by talking ourselves out of them, or by, bottling them up, or overanalyzing, as opposed to tuning into them.
And that tuning in is understanding what they are, and then going into figuring out what the facts are, like you said, problem solving. So you have to almost dig in, right?
Right.
And understand what is truth and what is not truth,
Yeah,
and
I
differentiate
kind
between
of
the
went a
two.
little process. It's label the feeling, identify where specifically it's coming from, and then what's in your control. So
What do
I'll
you
give
mean by
you
coming from?
why are you feeling that way? I
Okay,
hate to use the
why?
word why, but because I don't want people to analyze, I want them to tune into specifically what is making them feel that way, what in their
Okay,
life is
got it.
making them feel that way. So I can give you a little example.
That'd be
A
great.
couple of years ago, I was, getting up, getting ready, and as soon as I went to blow dry my hair, I noticed all of a sudden my arm would feel really heavy. And this happened 3 days in a row, and I was like, "What is this?" So after it happened the third time, I just decided to lay in bed and just be a little mindful about, what am I feeling, right? And where is this coming from? And what I realized is that I was feeling overextended, right? I was committing myself to too many things. So what I was feeling was overwhelmed. Where it was coming from was the fact that I was overly committed, and what's in my control is to drop some of those things. And in my case, that's what I ended up doing. And then the next day I felt fine.
This very much relates to values and what's important to you, because similarly, I made breakfast plans with a friend one day, and I was super excited to see this friend. But then instantly, for the next 3 days, I started swirling over this breakfast. And I'm like, why am I swirling about this? Like, what is going on? And it was because I have a very specific morning routine. And I love my morning routine, and it grounds me for the day. And it was going to interrupt that morning routine. Right. And a value of mine is to follow what's important to me. And what's important to me is that morning routine. Right.
Right.
And so I called the friend and I just said, hey, can we do lunch? But it took me 3 days of swirling over this breakfast, right? And how I was going to get my workout in, and how I was going to do this, that, and the other.
Right.
And he said, sure. And as soon as he said sure, it was like, poof, all of that went away.
Yep.
So it's really what you're describing is that feelings of aligning with your values and making sure you know what's important to you to begin with, right?
Yeah, I would
Yeah.
call them needs. You're tapping
Needs.
into your needs. So you have a routine for a reason. It fits certain needs that you have, right? And so what was happening is that you were feeling like your needs were not going to be met. And so that's when feelings come into play. For example, with anxiety, it usually means that we're feeling out of control about something or we feel threatened by something. Depression, it might be we're feeling overwhelmed or we're feeling helpless or hopeless. So, each feeling is sending you a different message. And so that's why it's important to label it first and then ask yourself, where is it coming from? Otherwise, yeah, you can spend days just ruminating, asking why. I'm almost programmed not to ask why because,
Really?
yes, I'll ask, how does that make you feel, or where is that coming from? What's going on? Because the why question tends to put people in that cerebral mode where they start analyzing, right? And that's when you start, that
Right. Swirling.
overthinking.
Yeah, that's swirling. So when I think about this from a corporate perspective, right? So performance reviews, right? That's the first thing that comes to my mind, right? Every time I would get a review, I would jump right to the development areas. I would gloss over the positives. And the positives could be a mile long and the development areas could be two things, but I would hyper focus on the development areas. And I think this is very common in women, but also in neurodivergent people, right? When you struggle with performance feedback or any sort of self-assessment, you know, why do we do that?
Well, what I would encourage you to do is rather than analyze it, is to go back to the feeling. So, what are you feeling when you're reading that performance review? What is coming up for you? Chances are it's fear of failure, right? And then you can specifically say to yourself, what specifically am I afraid of that would cause me to fail? So, I mean, I don't know if you could give me an example. What are the things that you might be afraid you might do that would cause you to fail?
It probably is just acceptance, right? I think for a lot of people, it's just, I want to be liked. I want to be accepted. I want people to see my value. I want people to know that I'm smart, or that I'm intelligent, or that I know what I'm doing, or that they can rely on me and trust me. I think it could be any of those things.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So, what I might do with you is I might say, if you were talking to a child or a good friend that you have, um, would you say to them, you should worry about being liked, you should worry about being accepted? You should look at that when you get that review. I want you to go and focus on the things that you didn't do well or that you might have gotten somewhat of a correction about. What would you say that?
Never, of course not. I would tell my friend, I'm like, look at all the great positives that are here. Nobody's perfect. There's always a few things that everybody can improve. I have things I can improve. I don't even work in corporate anymore, and I have things I can improve every day. So don't hyper focus on those. Look at all the positives. And what I always tell my clients is if 2% of the development areas are true, what adjustments would you make?
Mhm.
Right?
Right,
Like, just because you don't have to believe it all. Again, it's not the mirror, right? Like, we're not supposed to looking at other people because they're not a good mirror. So that's their
right,
opinion in
right.
the development areas. But even if that's their opinion and you don't believe it, if 2%, just say 2% of it was true, what would you do? Right?
So so I have an expression. I have a lot of expressions. One of them is be like Columbo without the trench coat and cigar. So if people, your audience out there is familiar with the 1970s detective show Columbo, he used to walk around with a rumpled trench coat and he was always carrying a cigar and he always asked a lot of questions. And so
Right.
that's what I encourage people to do. I call it embrace your humanity. Accept the fact that that's the other piece to all of this the self-validation is to be able to forgive yourself for being human. Again, there's nothing to be gained by beating yourself up. But what you can do is ask yourself, okay, what was going on for me that I handled the situation this way? What was I feeling or thinking that day, that week, that month, that year? What about my background might have contributed to the way that I handled that situation? Or what, in the case of work, what skills do I not have that would help me to handle? So what you're doing is you're being problem solving oriented, because again, that's why you have that anxiety. It's trying to get you to do something. So if you're feeling insecure or afraid of rejection, you go back to the problem solving. What's in my control?
What if I'm in the office and I'm in a meeting and I'm being triggered in that moment, right? I'm being emotionally activated and I can't sit there and say, excuse me, everybody, I'm going to pause for a moment while I figure out this feeling, right? Like, so what do I do in that moment, in that exact second, if I'm being triggered in a meeting or any sort of situation at work?
Right. Well, first of all, everyone has triggers. I say, love me, love my triggers. In other words, if you're in a relationship with somebody, you don't say, well, I'm not your mom. you say, okay, so I'm triggering, some memories of your mom. Let's talk about that. Where is that coming from? How can we work around that? And how can you also resolve it? But in a meeting, if you are familiar with your triggers, then you can put what you're feeling in context. So I have an analogy. Let's say I have a pitcher and I pour in soda and then coffee and then orange juice. When I go to pour out the soda, the coffee and the orange juice are going to come with it. That's what being triggered is about. And so, so number one, understanding what your triggers are so that you can put them in context and say, hey, I'm aware that I am feeling probably more anxious than this situation calls for. So that's probably telling me that I'm being triggered. And then the second thing is to do some grounding. If people aren't aware of what grounding is, it's basically putting your mind where your body is, getting yourself back to the present moment, feeling your feet on the floor, feeling yourself sitting in the chair, listening for people talking, looking around the room and seeing, the computer screen, whatever, right? Taking in the different senses. And so getting yourself back in the present moment and then committing to yourself that this is not the time and the place for me to deal with this, but I will deal with it. I will deal with it later today when I have a chance to. If you don't commit to dealing with it at some point, then it's going to continue to do that to you. It's going to continue to trigger you. Right.
Yeah.
Going back to what we were talking about feelings, there's only two ways to cope with emotions, either proactively or reactively. So if you're not taking the time to identify your feelings, where they're coming from, right, and what's in your control, then they don't go away. They still influence your behavior, but they're going to do it in a reactionary way. And that's what happens a lot with people, is that they don't take the time to acknowledge their emotions and to use them to make good decisions. And so they end up making decisions based on part of their feelings or, not feeling at all. And so it might be a defense mechanism. And so as a result, they make bad decisions. I mean, usually when somebody's making a bad decision, it's because they're not taking time to be in touch with all of their emotions. Each emotion represents a need. And most of the time, we will have multiple feelings at the same time because we have multiple needs at the same time. So part of problem solving is identifying all of your needs, aka all of your feelings, and coming up with solutions that take into account all of those needs. If you don't do that, then again, they don't go away. They will just affect you, but in a reactionary way.
Yeah, I always say you can only control your actions and reactions. You can't control other people. So if they're going to
Exactly.
trigger you, if they trigger you, then you have to understand what your reaction is, like what's happening in your body in that
Right.
moment, right?
Right.
Where do you feel it? What's it coming up? Is the reaction that, like you said, equivalent to the moment, right? Or is there something more going on there? Is this coming, you mentioned childhood, like some of this could be coming from trauma, like from previous work experiences or from a previous bad boss or from even a childhood issue if you were ignored your whole childhood and now, you're being ignored in a meeting. You can now, that could come up for you in that moment, but you have to understand that.
Exactly. Right. The more you understand the context, the more you can control it. People talk about feelings as a weakness, but actually, again, if you're not being proactive, then your feelings are controlling you rather than the other way around. So, if you can be aware of your triggers and where they're coming from, then you can explain them, articulate them to other people if you need to, but at least to yourself so that you know how to respond appropriately. You know how much of this am I reacting to what's going on in the present, and how much of this is something from the past? And then you need to address both of those things.
Well, how do you address it? That's the thing. Like, okay, I identify my feeling. I know why I'm triggered. I know where it's coming from. Then what do I do?
Well, if it's something that has to do with in the present moment, hopefully you can go to that person and tell them, I'm aware that I was feeling this way or reacted this way because of, something else and that has nothing to do with this situation. It depends on how much you want to go into it. Again, this goes back to feelings in the workplace. We really do need to have feelings in the workplace. So hopefully, you're in a place where you can talk about feelings, but, say, I reacted when I was in the Army. And so I would use the word reaction instead of feelings. But, I reacted in a certain way because of something else that was going on, something else that other experience that I had. And so being able to smooth that over, explain it. But, it also means going back and processing the past. And really, the best way to do that is through therapy. I believe that everybody needs therapy at some time in their life.
I
Just
agree,
like,
actually. 100%. I'm a career executive and team coach, and I always love it when my clients come to me and tell me they're already in therapy.
right. Because, we don't have a problem saying, you know what, I've had headaches for weeks. I'm going to go to my primary and see what this is all about. Right. But when, we're struggling at work or struggling with our parenting or, we're having trouble sleeping or we're worrying a lot, or we're having anger issues, we don't think to go to a therapist. And
Hmm.
that's exactly what they're there for. So that anytime something crops up, to think about this is something that a therapist can help me with, just like we think of primary care.
I think that's a really good segue actually into imposter syndrome because I think if you don't deal with this, if you don't deal with your triggers, if you don't deal with that negative Nelly voice that's in your head, if you don't deal with that inner critic, right? That inner mean girl critic, or if you have perfectionism, I think then it leads to imposter syndrome down the line because I see this in so many executives. They do not see themselves the way I see them at all. They are visionaries. They are intelligent. They can solve any problem. They sometimes lack confidence in knowing their own power and their own capabilities. And it doesn't change the higher you go. It doesn't. And I'm wondering, do you find the same thing in that? Like they haven't dealt with all that underneath and therefore the imposter syndrome comes out on top?
Mhm. Absolutely. And I think it's universal because it's a coping mechanism. It's not socioeconomically derived, right? It's not necessarily comes from certain experiences that you've had or how successful you've been. How you've learned to cope with your fear of rejection and failure, right, is basically where that comes from. And so if you haven't learned to not do those things that we talked about, then, that's the way you're going to handle it. And because we live in a culture, we don't talk about feelings and their usefulness, people don't tend to approach it that way from a feeling perspective. They tend to approach it cerebrally.
So how do you help someone? They logically know that they're great at their job, but they feel like a fraud.
Right.
And they don't believe in themselves, or they don't believe in the decisions they're about to make, or they are scared that somebody's going to take their job. Because I see that as well, where they shut people out, they leave people out of meetings, they leave people out of important events because they're scared somebody's going to come in and take their job from them.
So it's complicated. And like I say, if it were easy, you would have figured it out already. But it's really, there's a couple of different layers to it. So first of all, again, you go back to what is the basis? A fear of rejection, fear of failure. That's normal. But the way to cope with it is not to beat yourself up. If you were talking to somebody else that you cared about, you would never say to them, look, if you want to avoid rejection and failure, here's what you need to do. You need to mind read, second guess yourself, anticipate other people's reactions, self-criticize, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You would never say that. And yet that's exactly what you're doing, right? What would you say instead? You probably say, okay, well, if it's something where the person feels like they could have handled something differently, let's look at that. Let's be problem solving oriented. What went well? What didn't go well? What would you do differently? If it's more of an insecurity, then, we have to look at that. Again, there's that piece as well. Those feelings of inadequacy. I'm not good enough. I'm not deserving. There's something inherently wrong with me. And I think if you tune into it, you will recognize that in yourself, because I find that is what most people carry around with them, is those feelings of inadequacy. And so dealing with that, depending on, where it comes from, if it comes from being in a situation where you feel as though you are not necessarily as equipped, maybe it's a new role. I think we all experience feelings of inadequacy when we're trying something new, when we get outside our comfort zone. And then you go to, okay, well, what's in my control to address the things that I feel insecure about? Trust yourself that you are good enough the way that you are. I'm good enough the way that I am. Doesn't mean that I'm perfect, and that I'm deserving, right? And that I'm not going to anticipate. If somebody has something they want to say to me, they can say it to me, and they should do so appropriately. Otherwise, I'm going to continue to trust my instincts. And then again, that's where the self-validation comes in. We talked about one of those techniques, which is be your own best friend. Let me talk about the other one. It's called opposite of the golden rule. And so what that is what the golden rule is.
Right.
Treat other people the way you want to be treated. So the opposite of the golden rule is you have a right to be treated the way you treat other people. So if somebody else is making you feel bad about yourself, in other words, somebody else is being the bully instead of you're being the bully to yourself, ask yourself, if the situation reversed, would I talk to this person the way they're talking to me? Would I treat them the way that they're treating me? And if the answer is no, then that tells you something about where the problem is.
Is it you being triggered by something they're saying, or is it the actual, way they're delivering it that's the problem?
Mm-hmm. Well, that's an interesting question. So I have something called perception and intent, and both are valid. So even if somebody has good intentions, you have a right to be impacted whatever way you're impacted. You have a right to feel the way that you feel. It doesn't mean that that person did something wrong. It doesn't mean that you're wrong either. It just means that, right, that you have a different perspective. And so when it comes to relationships, it's important to understand both and to not make assumptions. So you could check in with somebody and say, hey, when you said this, it made me feel this way. But I don't want to make any assumptions, so I'm checking in with you first. Is that how you meant to come across? And most of the time, the person's going to go, no, that wasn't my intention to make you feel that way. Now, that doesn't mean that you don't have a right to your feelings, but it does give you a context. At least you know the other person wasn't intending it. But then you can have a conversation about, okay, where do we go from here? I see that the way that I'm speaking makes you feel ignored, and you see that I didn't mean to ignore you. So, because that's what communication is about. It's really about understanding so that you can problem solve and move forward. It's not
And it's
about
about
getting
curiosity.
see things the
Yeah.
other way. Yeah, absolutely. That's empathy. Empathy is curiosity. Exactly.
Exactly.
So getting back to the opposite of the golden rule. The reason why I tell people to ask themselves, if the situation reversed, how would you speak to this other person? Because I find that when we're talking to other people, we're talking from a place of reason and values. When we're talking to ourselves, it's from a place of fear and insecurity. And so that's a big part of my Embrace Your Humanity method, is it's getting people to tap into their instincts. We have good instincts if we use reason and values instead of emotion, right?
I feel like you just described every high achieving woman out there. Where we're in our heads, right? And we're in that emotion place versus the facts place. Nobody teaches this in school or any leadership training. Like, what should they be teaching in leadership training in these spaces? Because I think this would solve a lot of problems in the corporate environment.
Yeah, well, I think we need to be teaching emotional intelligence, right? Which means a lot of different things. But it's basically understanding that emotions are practical, right? And they are information, and so we should be using them as such. And we have multiple feelings at the same time because we have multiple needs at the same time, and so we need to tap into all of our feelings in order to come up with good solutions, as opposed to what we often do is come up with solutions first and then banter them back and forth, right, as to which is the best one, instead of focusing on what are the underlying needs, and then let's come up with solutions that meet those needs.
If people default into what I call the overs, right? The overbearing, the overproductive, the overachievement, the over everythings, what's the first place to start if that's their common default way of behaving or way of being?
Mm-hmm. Well, it's, I guess what we're talking about there is like perfectionism, right? And so the overachieving or being overbearing, all of that is, again, another coping mechanism, right? It's a maladaptive coping mechanism there's feelings underneath that. And so depending on what it is, usually when we're talking about perfectionism or even being overbearing, we're talking about control, feeling out of control. And so it's normal to want to feel in control, but that's not the way to go about it. Another one of my expressions is we don't have a crystal ball to see into the future, but what we can have is a toolbox full of coping skills to take with us wherever we go. And so a lot of times people engage in worrying, for example, because or perfectionism because they think that they want to try to control every variable. They anticipate every outcome, and so that's how they become controlling or they become perfectionistic. But the reality is that you'll never be able to do that. There's always going to be some level of unpredictability. So the answer is to do the things that are in your control, but then to trust yourself that no matter what comes your way, you will find a way to handle it. And the more tools you have in your toolbox, the more confident and competent you will be. And that's again where, where counseling comes in, or there's other ways of, just building up your toolbox, I think is important. But recognizing, that the way to deal with feeling out of control or uncertainty is not to be overly controlling.
I want to point out the word controlling is such a negative word, right? Like we always think like, oh, you're trying to control other people, or you're trying to control this, or you're trying to control that. But this is about controlling yourself and how you're trying to control your own work. I mean, I am definitely an example of this for sure. I had to unlearn overworking and overstriving and overcommitting and overing in everything in my life. And I didn't actually learn it until I became an entrepreneur. That's when I learned it. I tried to learn it in the corporate environment, but it was really hard for me to do that. And then I came up with this little phrase, and I have to remind myself of this daily, Elaine, daily. Life is not about activities, achievements, and accolades, because activities keep you busy and stop you from actually thinking and understanding your feelings. Achievements, you're looking for other people's validation versus your own, and same with accolades, right? Achievements is about, trying to get the next thing done, and then accolades is about all that validation from other people versus yourself.
Right.
And that's where I focused most of my life. And I had to reframe that into reminding myself that life is about living, which is doing things that bring you peace and fulfillment, right? About truly living your life within your values of what's important to you, your needs, as you describe them.
Mm-hmm.
Loving, which is building connection with others, which is super important to me, and learning, because I'm learning every single day. And so I think it's hard for people because they don't pause, and then they hear that word control and they freak out going, I'm not controlling, but you're really trying to control yourself. It's not about controlling others. And I think they miss that. Have you ever had to unlearn anything and change your relationship? Because this is about changing your relationship with yourself in the workplace.
Right. Well, I think for me, one of the reasons that I ended up going into the Army at the age of 42 was because I am very much somebody who likes to make a difference. I like to have a big impact. And so for me, just being comfortable with, I making a difference in my own little niche, and I think, especially if you're an entrepreneur, and you probably see this a lot with coaching, people come in with all of these ideas about what they want to do, right? And you got to tell them to narrow it down to one thing, right? That you're going to be an expert at. And so that's something that I've had to learn, to let go of some things. And I think that gets into something else that women do a lot of, which is we want to be everything. We feel like we should be able to do it all, right?
Everything for everybody. That's what we say, right? But you can't be everything for everybody. Sometimes you have to be everything for yourself as well.
Right.
And sometimes yourself has to come first, which is another thing I've learned. And being communicative about that. So, Elaine, this has been really enlightening for me, especially the part about the mirror, not letting others be the mirror of you and being the mirror of yourself. Thank you so much. How can people find you if they want to reach out to you?
Well, I have a YouTube channel called Ask the Therapist with Elaine Belson, and you have to put in Ask the Therapist with Elaine Belson, because there's a lot of therapists out there. And that's one way I invite people to go on there. I answer mental health questions in under a minute. So each video is under a minute. And then I have my website, which is elainebelson.com.
And that's Belson, everybody out
Correct.
there. Elaine Belson, Belson. And we'll also put that in the show notes as well. Thank you so much for being here. This has been super enlightening. Hopefully people, when they're triggered in the workplace, they will now take a pause for a moment and actually try to figure out what that is and work through the steps that you talked about today. And thank you for being here. I appreciate it.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me. It was very stimulating.
If you're listening and this episode struck a nerve, I want you to remember this. Your inner critic is loud, but it's not the truth. Your emotions are information, not instructions. And you have the power to retrain the way you respond to stress, self-doubt, and old stories that no longer serve you. If you want to learn more from Elaine, you can check out her YouTube channel, Ask the Therapist with Elaine Belson, or visit ElaineBelson.com. And if this episode helped you understand yourself just a little bit better today, please share it with a friend, leave a review, or send me a message. I always love hearing what resonates. Work Unscripted is produced and edited in partnership with the team at Palm Tree Podco and 21 Digby. The content for this week's episode was created by me, Marlo Lyons.